The moment no one saw coming, the palace doors opened, and every single camera moved past Camilla, not slowly, not accidentally, all at once, as if the room had already decided. Catherine stepped forward in white silk and diamonds, and before she had even taken 5 steps, the crowd erupted. No speech had been given. No royal word had been spoken. Just a woman walking into a room and completely changing the temperature inside it. Senior royals looked stunned. Staff exchanged glances they weren't sure they were supposed to exchange. And Camilla's family, gathered just off to the side, reportedly stood frozen, their practiced smiles fading in real time as the cameras kept following someone else. What made that moment so different from every other royal entrance before it? That's what we're digging into today, because this wasn't just one night at Buckingham Palace. It was the surface of something that had been quietly building for years. A shift so deliberate, so carefully timed, that by the time the public saw it, the people inside those walls had already felt it for months. Let's talk about what really happened. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to say a word. The room said it for her. Accounts from people inside the palace that evening describe the silence that followed as unusual. Not the polite pause between moments, but the deeper quiet that lands when people realize something has already changed and they missed exactly when it happened. Palace aides later admitted the atmosphere was unlike anything they'd witnessed in years. That kind of shift doesn't come from one appearance. It comes from a long run-up and quiet decisions made behind closed doors, roles adjusted in private, and a woman who had been studying the institution around her for decades finally deciding to stop holding back. Only a few months before, Catherine had been spotted on a relaxed outing in Norfolk, looking unusually loose and carefree, laughing with staff, riding a scooter around the grounds, sipping cider with local guests. Some dismissed it as a light moment after a difficult year. But people who'd watched her closely said they saw something else. They saw someone who had already figured out the next chapter and was comfortable enough to breathe before it started. That carefree afternoon and that charged palace entrance weren't opposites. They were the same woman at 2 different points on the same path. By early 2025, that path had become impossible to ignore inside the palace. Courtiers who had served since Queen Elizabeth's reign described Catherine's energy as intensely focused, not aggressive, not showy, just ahead. One senior insider reportedly said she seemed 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room, every single time. And when she stepped forward that evening, calm, unhurried, untouchable. The people who'd been watching that build-up understood immediately what they were seeing. The question is, how did it come to this? And when did Camilla's family realize that the access and influence they'd quietly built up over years was starting to disappear? For years, being connected to Camilla meant something inside the royal world. Her son Tom moved through elite gatherings with ease. Her daughter Laura and other relatives appeared at events that once seemed entirely out of reach for anyone outside the direct line. Slowly, quietly, Camilla had brought her family closer to the center of royal life. Not through titles or formal appointments, but through the most reliable currency in any institution, personal fervor from the person at the top. And King Charles had genuinely welcomed it. He'd spent decades fighting for Camilla's acceptance, watching her be kept at arm's length by protocol and public opinion. Once she was finally in, and once he was finally king, there was no reason to hold her family at a distance either. What nobody planned for was what would happen if Charles stopped being the one making the calls. In early 2024, Buckingham Palace confirmed that the king had been diagnosed with cancer. The announcement was controlled, carefully worded. But behind the palace walls, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Duties were quietly reshuffled. Engagements were restructured. Decisions that once moved through Charles's office began flowing through Catherine's instead. A well-placed royal source noted that this wasn't temporary coverage. It was a structured handover, already mapped out and moving forward with quiet certainty. By mid-2024, insiders were describing Catherine not as a stand-in, but as the stabilizing force of the monarchy. Meetings Charles couldn't attend weren't postponed. They happened, with Catherine in the room, making the calls, building relationships with the people who ran the institution. Camilla's family, watching from the sidelines, reportedly felt it before they could fully explain it. Invitations that had always come through started feeling less certain. Access that had been a given stopped feeling guaranteed. The warm connections they'd built around Charles's favor were solid. But Charles's favor wasn't the one being distributed anymore. What unsettled people most was that Catherine never made a scene about any of it. There were no confrontations, no pointed remarks at public events, no obvious signals of displeasure. What there was instead was distance, precise, deliberate, and impossible to misread once you noticed it. During one major royal gathering, palace insiders reported watching Catherine move through the room with total ease, greeting guests, anchoring conversations, commanding attention, while carefully, almost surgically, avoiding unnecessary interaction with Camilla's side of the family. That single observation reportedly triggered something close to panic in private. Trusted contacts were approached. Old alliances were quietly reviewed. The questions spreading through private conversations across London and Windsor all pointed toward the same uncomfortable truth. Whose favor actually mattered now? The tiara, the state visit, and the moment everything tightened. If there was one event that crystallized what was happening inside the palace, it was the state visit earlier in 2025. These occasions run on ritual. Every seat placement, every greeting order, every choice of dress or jewelry carries weight that most outside observers miss entirely. For people inside the royal world, it's a language. And what was spoken at that particular state banquet in the gilded rooms of Buckingham Palace was reportedly read as a message by everyone present. The tiara Catherine chose that evening became the most discussed detail inside palace walls for weeks afterward. To a casual observer watching on television, it was tradition, beautiful, historic, appropriate. But to the people who understood what certain choices mean at certain moments, which pieces carry which history, which selections signal continuity, and which signal change, the choice felt like something being said out loud without words. Insiders said, Camilla noticed, her staff noticed, and what followed was a shift in the private dynamic between the two sides that several aides described as the most strained it had been in years. Polite smiles stayed in place, but the warmth behind them disappeared. Meetings that had been planned jointly were quietly moved to different wings of the palace. Schedules were adjusted, so paths crossed less often. Communication between the two sides, previously handled with the easy rhythm of a shared institution, turned noticeably cooler. What made Camilla's position particularly difficult was the history beneath it. She had spent years rebuilding her public image, patiently, carefully, earning an acceptance that once seemed unimaginable. She had finally settled into her role as queen consort with the kind of quiet dignity that had won over even her harshest critics. And now, in the middle of all that stability, the ground was shifting again. This time, though, the challenge wasn't public opinion. It was internal. And internal challenges, when they happen inside an institution as layered as the British monarchy, are sometimes harder to fight than anything that plays out in the press. Disagreements had reportedly been building over several months. One centered on Prince Andrew and his continued residence at Royal Lodge. Charles, characteristically, leaned toward patience, toward keeping family ties intact, giving space for a gradual resolution. Catherine's position, according to people who followed the conversations, was less patient. She pushed for a clear removal from public proximity and a firm relocation out of Royal Lodge. Camilla found that approach too unilateral, too fast. A sign, she reportedly felt, that decisions once shared were now being made without her input. A separate tension arose over the York family more broadly, Charles favoring a path toward gradual reintegration, Catherine preferring a much more cautious approach. The gap between those two positions was about more than Andrew. It was about two different visions of what the monarchy needed to protect itself, and who got to decide which vision won. By the end of the state visit week, the palace was quietly divided. Not visibly, not loudly, but divided in the way that actually matters inside places like this. In private conversations, in adjusted schedules, in the small signals only insiders can read. By late 2025 and into 2026, what had started as a quiet shift had become something more structural. The decisions that once took weeks of careful discussion inside palace meetings were reportedly being settled within hours. Long-standing arrangements were being reviewed with what several senior aides described as blunt, unsentimental clarity. Legacy wasn't currency anymore. Loyalty without visible contribution wasn't protection. Every role, every invitation, every piece of access was being measured against a single question. Does this make the institution stronger? For Camilla's extended family, that question had an uncomfortable answer. Their influence had been built on proximity, on warm personal ties with Charles, on quiet access through Clarence House. Catherine's version of the monarchy doesn't run on sentiment, it runs on accountability. Modest contributions that once felt like enough no longer guaranteed a place at the table. Camilla herself had been noticeably absent from key public appearances alongside the new leadership since early 2026. The silence around her position deepened the uncertainty. In rooms where she was once consulted, conversations continued without her. Not aggressively, not with any public drama, just without her. Palace observers quietly noted that this was how Catherine operated across the board. Not through confrontation, but through reorganization. She didn't need to push people out. She simply built a structure that didn't require them. At the center of the new structure was a vision of the monarchy that Catherine had apparently been developing for years. What emerged in conversations with royal editor Rebecca English and others was a picture of an institution deliberately moving away from heavy ceremony and towards something more purposeful. Shorter events, fewer displays of excess, a smaller but sharper royal household focused on visible impact over inherited tradition, fewer ceremonial engagements, more direct public connection. A monarchy that earns its relevance rather than assuming it. The planned coronation, when it comes, is expected to reflect exactly that. Shorter than historical precedent, simpler in staging, but intentional in meaning. Long-standing traditions like trooping the color remain, but reshaped around relevance rather than spectacle. Even the question of what happens with Harry and Meghan's titles is reportedly being handled with the same philosophy. No dramatic moves, no public battles, just a long-term focus on credibility over noise. What's striking to the people who watched Catherine arrive at this position is how long the preparation took. This wasn't a response to Charles's illness. His diagnosis in early 2024 accelerated a transition that was already in motion. The private calculations, the careful repositioning, the quiet accumulation of institutional authority, all of it predates the cancer announcement. It predates the visible shift. It goes back to a woman who had been studying the institution around her for over a decade and had quietly decided, at some point along the way, exactly what she was going to do with it. Her middle-class background, royal observers often note, gives her something rare inside palace walls, a sense of what life looks like from outside them. That perspective shows up in her decisions. It shows up in the way she talks about the monarchy's purpose, in the emphasis she places on public trust over royal spectacle, in the firm belief, visible in everything from her South Africa remarks to her handling of the Andrew situation, that the institution exists to serve something larger than itself. What she built slowly. What she's changed deliberately. And what she's creating, a monarchy shaped less by grandeur and more by trust, is already visible to anyone paying close attention. Camilla's family stood frozen that evening when the palace doors opened and every eye moved past them. Not because Catherine was cruel, not because she staged a confrontation, but because the room understood, in that one moment, what had quietly been true for months already. The era had changed, and the new one hadn't waited to be announced. These stories provide insight into how power inside historic institutions really moves, not through speeches or ceremonies, but through quiet repositioning, steady focus, and the patience to let the room catch up to what's already been decided.